welcome to the MessianTics Podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the MessianTics Podcast. We are continuing in a series that we started recording recently on basically asking our listeners on our social media to give us questions that they may have that they'd like to see us address on an episode of the podcast. And so this particular episode, we're going to dive into a question that I think is intriguing and interesting, and it actually didn't come directly from our post on social media, but rather from a question that Rabbi Toby and I got at our congregation, but from an individual who's also a listener of the podcast. So the question is this: how have you seen Messianic Judaism change since you first became involved? Maybe your top three positive changes, maybe even issues that have grown that concern you. And I'll point out, just for interest's sake, there's actually a varied range of involvement in Messianic Judaism in the room right now. Rabbi Jonathan's been in Messianic Judaism for a little less than a decade, Rabbi Toby for almost 2 decades, and then myself and Rabbi Eric pretty much the same amount of time, seeing as, I was still living in his house at the time, but it's been, almost 40 years, 35 years or so that we've been involved with Messianic Judaism. So over that course of time, and I think it'll be intriguing listening to the comments that are made, because as we look at longer, lesser, etc., it'll be interesting to see from different perspectives what things have changed, positive, negative, etc., and kind of see where things are going from there. So with that said, I'll kind of toss that softball out and let whoever wants to dive into it, dive in.
Well, I know that, for instance, the organizations have grown. That's one of the things that we see. When I became an ordained rabbi in the IMCS, I was like the 25th or 26th ordained rabbi in the organization. Now we have considerable more than that. There were much fewer congregations. Now I think we have 170-ish congregations in the IMCS, maybe a little more. Same thing with the union. It was much smaller back then, much in some ways closer knit, because when you have fewer people in something, it kind of forces a closer together, us against, kind of like we're together and the others are the outsiders kind of thing. So it kind of forces a closeness that doesn't exist in some ways anymore, not because people don't want to necessarily be close, but because there's so many more people involved. It's kind of like when you have a small congregation of 25 or 30 people, they're much more intimately connected than a congregation of 150 or 200, just simply because of numbers and those things. So there's that. There was, when I first started with the IMCS and the MJA, for instance, the Southeast Conference was planned by the Southeast rabbis. So everything that was going on was orchestrated, the planning, the theme, all of that, who was going to teach, who was not going to teach, was all done by the rabbis, and the cost was significantly less. Of course, part of that is time. As time goes on, costs increase. So now when the conference is set up, there's a national conference committee that is actively involved in choosing who's going to speak and what, all that kind of stuff. So there's differences that just came from growth in that way. Some good, some I would think are less ideal. But that's just from growth. I think sometimes just simple growth makes a difference and changes things.
I think one of the things that stands out to me, and this is a it's an interesting issue to see, and we've talked about it a bit. Rabbi Eric and I have specifically the MJA, the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, which originally was a kind of a gathering place for Messianic Jewish believers in America to come together, and then you have Messianic Jewish alliances in other countries. Like there's the Alliance of Mexico, there's the alliance in I think the UK, there's an alliance in Germany and Israel and so on and so forth. Which, by the way, if you want some really awesome, up-to-date, modern Messianic Jewish music out of Israel, go to Spotify and look up the Messianic Jewish Alliance of Israel Spotify playlist. Phenomenal stuff. Great resource. But backtracking to the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America is that the MJA has, at least in my perception, has stopped focusing as much on America and almost entirely focuses on Israel, on projects in Africa and India and such. Which, and I don't want this to come across as like those things are terrible. But if we're the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, what are we doing for Messianic Jews and spreading the good news to Jews who do not know Messiah yet in America as an organization? Is it just that we have congregations in the U.S. and that's their thing? And if that's the case, then what's the purpose of the MJA at this point? And so that's one thing I've seen change over the course of the years was it's got less focus on the individuals in America and more focus on kind of an international effort, which in and of itself, not a terrible thing. I'm not saying that as a slant against the MJA, just something I've noticed. I don't see there being as much of that kind of knitting the community together.
The conferences used to feel as if they were for developing communities, developing teachings, sharing among each other, things like that. Now there's a very big feel of it being a means to get people to donate to the Joseph Project or the MJIF or these other programs. And again, as Rabbi David said, that's not saying those things are unimportant or unnecessary or not things we should support or focus on. But the feel of the gatherings is much more humanitarian aid focused than it seems to be on community and building congregations and enhancing communities in the U.S. So that is something that changed. Also, just personally, it used to be that, for instance, at the Southeast Conference or at the Messiah Conference, people would just sit around and talk until the late night, early morning hours, just having fellowship and sitting around talking and sharing about their families and what's going on and things like that. Now it doesn't seem like that happens, at least not with me. And that may be that the people my age are now going to bed earlier, and the people that are staying up till midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning are the younger people.
Yeah, that'd be us.
So, but there used to be after the services, people would hang out and fellowship for hours and hours and hours because we only got to see each other 2 or 3 times a year. And there doesn't seem to be, like last time I was at the Rosen Plaza at the conference, it was like 11 o'clock and there was nobody in the lobby area or anything that was still there. So those things kind of change. And again, not good or bad, just changes. It used to be at the conferences they had themes or tracks that, there was a prophecy track and there was a lifestyle track and there was this. There doesn't seem to be those tracks anymore. It more seems to be just whoever's teaching on things through that. And that may be perception. But it used to be actually, you could look at the brochure and it'd say prophecy track, and it would have that all the ones that are teaching on that track in that list. So those are things things that I do like about the conferences now that changed since it first started. When we first started I started being a part of the conferences like the Southeast, the youth had a totally separate Shabbat service. So there was a YMJA Shabbat service at the same time. There was the MJA Shabbat service. And now it's a unified service. So I see that as a change since we've been, but one that I really enjoy and appreciate that change being made.
I'm going to throw this over to Rabbi Toby because this was actually something he had said, and I think he's got something great to say on, but the music of Messianic Judaism has changed a lot over the years also.
I just made the comment yesterday when we had our Bible study. I just simply said that music being indicative of the Messianic music today being indicative of how more people know about Messianic Judaism. When I first became involved in the movement, which was 2005, I remember the first time I went to a Messianic synagogue, and my first few months there, becoming acquainted with what Messianic Judaism was, and hearing this music that the worship team was playing. I'd never heard it before. It was obviously different from what I would hear on like Christian radio, and so I would hear this music, and I would ask the worship leader, and eventually I became a member of the worship team as a bass player after a few months. So I kind of had some insider knowledge of the music and stuff, and it was all new to me, but I loved every bit of it. And the only people that I ever saw music from when it was Messianic was, I discovered Paul Wilbur. I didn't know he existed before I came to Messianic Judaism. I'd never heard of Israel's Hope, which was the band Paul Wilbur was a part of before he went off on his own. And then, of course, there was Joel Chernoff, and then there was Marty Goetz, and there was Ted Pierce. It was like I called them the Big Four. They were the only four guys that I knew of. There were others. There was Barry and Batya Siegel. In fact, that's actually the first Messianic music CD I owned was Barry and Batya Siegel. And that was like it. It was like 4 or 5 groups. And I had no idea. These guys had been doing it since the 70s. But I was in the church, and there's plenty of church music to go around for everyone. So the thing is, now, though, today, and being involved in Messianic worship ministry up until the past couple years. I've not really been involved in worship, but I was a worship leader in Georgia at 2 congregations, and was a part of Meochad, which was a Messianic worship ministry that was about gathering musicians and seeing. It was like a grassroots movement of gathering musicians together and exhorting and encouraging each other. But the point is that when we started Meochad, which lasted 5 years, which was 2015, man, people came out of the woodwork. Like all kinds of artists came out, and I realized that there was that in just 10 years there had been a massive growth in Messianic music. And now you have like Joshua Aaron. Now Joshua Aaron's just one guy, it's not like we had 4 people, Paul Wilbur, Joel Chernoff, Ted Pierce, and Marty Goetz, and they're being replaced by just 4 more. I know there's a lot more out there, but Joshua Aaron is a great example because he's crossed over into mainstream notoriety. I remember when he posted "How Great Is Our God," which his rendition of it, which it was written by I think Ed Cash and Chris Tomlin, but when he did "How Great Is Our God" in Hebrew, he covered it. He covered the song. He posted that on YouTube, and it like skyrocketed. It was a really well done, well produced music video, and of course Joshua Aaron's excellent at what he does. But I realized then, I'm like, man, okay, that's great. Like, more people are going to find out about Messianic Judaism simply because of like Joshua Aaron. Right. And now we see what Joshua Aaron has done in recent years by working with Aaron Schust, who, he's a Dove Award winning Christian artist. So, and I do remember there being a time like a decade ago or more, that you could talk to someone about Messianic Judaism and they wouldn't know what you were talking about. Never heard of Messianic Judaism or Messianic synagogue. That's markedly different today. Mm-hmm. Knowledge of Messianic Judaism has increased, so that's a difference that I think is really good, is the increase of knowledge. And music's been a big part of that. Guys like Joshua Aaron have been a big part of, whether they realize it or not,
Mekedem and Sulu and others that have just come out.
Right. Yeah. That has been incredibly encouraging, that more and more people know about it. And I think it will continue to increase in knowledge, because I think that the prophetic the prophetic trajectory of Messianic Judaism and the prophetic trajectory of the Jewish people is talked about in the Bible over and over and over. So I think that that's only going to continue. But to see that happen in your lifetime, to see that knowledge increase is really encouraging. So that was one difference I'd seen, and I haven't been in, I've been involved in the movement for 20 years. And so seeing that has been good. So seeing an increase in knowledge. I'm seeing an increase in just people's involvement as well. I mean, congregations are growing, people are, FFOZ's tour clubs are growing. I think that's God pouring His Spirit out, I think you're seeing an increase, and you're going to see an increase. I know we've talked about it a lot as far as how some Jewish leaders in the Messianic movement feel about non-Jews. But you're not going to stop that influx of people from the nations coming. That's going to continue to happen, and I've seen a growth in that.
There's a lot of churches now that is an active part of their Sunday school curriculum use.
Yeah, and that goes hand in hand with like Gateway hosting is it a Messianic fellowship that Gateway has? Okay, so that was not going on decades ago.
Yeah.
Right.
So
the largest or one of the largest Messianic gatherings, monthly regular gathering in the world takes place at a church.
Right.
And it's led by, it's not like a Messianic congregation is renting space. They have a Messianic Jewish service as part of their church life.
Yeah.
And they have 1,000 or more people that gather together every month there.
And that's fantastic. And the last thing I think I'm going to say before I pass on to someone else, at least, is for now, I'm not saying I'm done talking. I'm just saying that what I'm saying is on this line of thinking as far as growth, is in the educational realm. When I was in the Messianic movement, the first few years, like 2005, 6, and 7, those first 3 years were like, really my first 5 years, 2005 to 2010, those were like my formative years of learning and being discipled. I was discipled during those first 5 years by my first rabbi. And so I remember, though, education and training in ministry, I don't think it's where it should be, and we've talked about that as far as comparing the organizations. That there's one organization that I think the training is not quite what it should be as far as having a high standard. And I think when we talk about another certain organization, I think the standards are too lofty. So we've talked about that. But what I'm saying is the fact that there's stuff out there like MJIT and the King's University and things like that, those are things that I had never heard of, Messianic Jewish Studies programs and things like that. But now these things are happening. And I think that they have issues, but I think that and I'm hoping those issues will level off and become more accessible to people, and more affordable, of course. But the fact is that I didn't know how to do anything as far as finding Messianic music and finding a track to be educated and grow in leadership my first 5 years. And now someone who's coming in now, if they come in and say 2024, they're coming in now, it is not going to be as hard today as it was for me 20 years ago to find out, what if I want Messianic Jewish education, where are Messianic musical artists and things like that. It's so much more readily available.
Right.
And the knowledge has increased. And so that's what I've noticed.
Two other things that I wanted to say. One is that when I first became involved in the Messianic movement, there were almost no books written by Messianic Jewish authors, by people in that realm. There was the Complete Jewish Bible was out. There were a handful of other. Barney Kasdan had written a couple of books. There were a few others. Now there's hundreds. If you go to Amazon and look on Messianic Judaism in the section, you'll see hundreds of books written on that. But the other thing that changed, and Rabbi Jonathan and I were talking about this the other day, is when we first started our congregation, or when I first took over the congregation in Mobile, either one, when somebody came to the congregation, it was and many times their very first experience with anything Messianic Jewish. Somebody showed up, they'd never heard a Messianic Jewish song, If they were from a Jewish background, they knew liturgy, but they didn't know Messianic. If they were from the church, they didn't know liturgy at all. There was no connection. It was a very big culture shock for anybody coming. Now, almost nobody comes to our congregation that hasn't watched our services on the internet, watched our Bible studies, and sometimes for months or even years before they come in. So when they come in, there is not a shock to their system. It's not what it was that somebody would come and it was their very first experience with anything Messianic Jewish. Right. Now people come and they've already been, like, they know the rabbi, they know the worship leader, they know some of the songs, they know some of the liturgy, even if they're not from a Jewish background. They know what to expect, at least from what they see on the videos.
Yeah, they feel more comfortable. They're kind of excited because they're like, oh, I've been watching this and now I'm actually here doing the thing. I've been here and I've been in Messianic Judaism the least amount of time, and so a lot of my experience is very contemporary. I've been living a Messianic lifestyle for about 8 years now, so a little bit less than a decade. And I think what's interesting, things that I've noticed just because of past recordings and things. So, for example, I've had to take several IMCS classes. Still am in IMCS classes for the yeshiva. And I've seen some ones from back in like 90-something. I think one of my most recent ones was filmed in 2012. And to watch those classes now and then to watch the ones today or attend the ones today, there's definitely more of a, let's say, a willingness on behalf of Gentile academia to contribute. So, for example, for the past 2 or 3 years now, they have had non-Messianic professors, Christian professors, but they're non-Messianic, come in and teach yeshiva classes and be recorded. I think the first one was from like Luther Rice or something, college. I think it's in Georgia. But he came and he was a professor I think at a Messiah conference one year back in 2022, I think. And this year they have another guy who I don't believe he's Messianic either. So it's been interesting to see, like, to be watching my classes and to be looking at all the names and titles for the classes, going back, a decade and a half, 2 decades, where it's almost all internal. It's all IMCS rabbis. It's all, or at least close friends of the Messianic movement, but they're also Jewish. Like, for example, Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown is, he lives in both worlds. Sometimes
he straddles the line.
Yeah, he straddles the line a lot. He's like he's Messianic, but he's also more Pentecostal, charismatic Christian. I've taken a class with him, and he's great.
I would definitely say he qualifies himself as much more in the church world than in the Messianic
world. Absolutely, yeah. But it's been nice to see within just my time of being here, the IMCS Yeshiva kind of branching out to bring in other professionals, other people who are good in their field.
You mean we don't know it all?
Oh, yeah. God forbid.
There's something we can learn from the rest of the body? Say it ain't so.
So that's been good. Well,
and part of that is that the organizations have in some way matured to the place where they trust.
Right.
Because when you're first starting, you become insular. You want to protect, you want to preserve, you want to make sure that what's being taught, being shared is going to be positive to the group that's learning and all. And as you grow, you learn to trust the people not only that are taking the classes, that they're not going to be infected by something that someone might say, but also trust and understand the greater body and the involvement to where we invite people to teach that are experts in fields like archaeology and things that may not be Messianic, but are experts in their field.
Right. So it's been exciting to see that change happen just within my short time of being here.
And I also want to plug the Ashrenu School, which is that's huge. It's an online yeshiva for children ages. Well, I mean, it goes from like ages 7 or 8 until like high school age, and a Shriner school or anything like it. Nothing like that existed in 2005.
Right.
Nothing like that existed in 2015.
Right.
And my children are a part of it. Well, my son is. I'm going to get my daughter into it when she reaches a certain age, but my son has been in it since he was 8. I'm just saying that there is a Messianic online, and my son's been a part of it for 2 years, and I can tell you it's done with excellence. I'm saying that, again, that's an opportunity for children to learn Hebrew. And they're not just learning Hebrew, they're learning everything about the Bible and Jewish lifestyle and this, that, and the other. And it's all Messianic. Teachers are Messianic and this, that, and the other. And again, that just to me is an example of how Messianic Judaism is growing.
Right.
And its resources are increasing, and opportunities to plug in at a young age or any age, opportunities to be educated, and opportunities to just learn more about it are increasing. So.
Right. I think a couple years ago we were at Messiah Conference, and in the marketplace there was a new basically a Messianic dating site, dating app, a matchmaking for Messianic, Jewish only
Messianic matchmakers.
And I was like, dude, like 10 years, just from what I knew about Messianic Judaism at the time, was that, dude, 15 years ago you could not have done this.
Because
there weren't enough people.
Where you have a dating site, you have arrived.
Right.
Was that the one who that like they ran into problems because it was like only Jewish people, and then they had to open it up or something?
I have no idea what problems they face. I'm sure that, you're bound to run into that issue.
I thought I heard something like that.
It's possible.
I don't want. Okay, well then forgive. I don't want to make an assumption. It's just
Yeah, you're bound to run into that issue if that's your goal, because again, Messianic Judaism, despite being a Jewish movement, is overwhelmingly Gentile. And its attendees.
I wanted to ask Rabbi Eric because, and I think I've asked you this before when we were talking about some other topic, but. And this isn't necessarily a positive or negative thing, but because I think it speaks more to the conferences, but like the Southeast Regional, like the MJA. Now, I remember at one point it was growing, and everybody loves to blame COVID now for lack of attendance and this, that, and the other. Well, COVID. And I'm like, before COVID, I think there was some stagnation. I don't know.
Yeah, the Southeast Conference was growing, and then they adjusted how they were doing it. They formed a national conference committee. They changed the prices. They adjusted things. Things cost more,
and they nationalized
it. So everybody was doing the same, and that ended up causing a dip in attendance. Yes. And then through COVID, there was that. Now, I will say that after COVID, we've started seeing some growth back again, so we're on an increase.
I know the youth retreats have grown.
Right. So sometimes when you make a change, there's a pushback against the change, and then you overcome it and you keep going beyond that. And I think that's where we're at now.
Okay.
Is that there was a response to that. One thing I wanted to bring up that when I first became involved in the Messianic Jewish movement, almost no congregation had their own building. There were very, very few that had their own building. Messianic Judaism was largely meeting in either rented church buildings or storefronts or, places like that, people's houses, things like that.
Hotel conference rooms.
Now we have buildings, for instance, Baruch Hashem in Dallas has an amazing facility.
Beth Messiah in Houston.
Beth Messiah in Houston does. Beth Hillel in Atlanta has a wonderful facility. Jonathan Kahn's synagogue in New Jersey has their own large building that they own. Our congregation has a building.
Temple Arona Kodesh in Fort Lauderdale.
Arona Kodesh has a nice building. So, and even like some of the smaller congregations, Beit Israel in Biola Battery has their own building. It's a smaller building, but they're in a smaller community. Those kind of things, but it's much more that congregations are not, there's that kind of weird group that meets in the fellowship hall of a church or a storefront somewhere, but now they're established buildings in communities and are growing in that way. So that's another way that it's changed. It really was.
Or that one random classroom in the back of the property at the Baptist church you guys used to use that you had to give directions to get to the property and then extra directions to find where the congregation went.
We're hidden back here somewhere. You'll find us.
Yeah,
here's phase 1 of your directions. Here's phase 2, 3, and 5.
Yeah, you had to have a GPS to lead you from the entrance of the building to the facility. But that has changed as congregations grew, and so there's a lot more congregations that have their own buildings. And another change that I found fascinating that happened just a few years ago is that Messianic Judaism used to purposely keep themselves. In other words, if you rented from a church, you wanted a separate sign, a separate thing. You wanted people to know we're not them. They're them, and we rent their facility. We're meeting at the facility of, or whatever. Now there are Messianic congregations that are actually part of or staffing of congregations, or meet as once a month or twice a month, connected with a Christian church. The fear of infection or something by being connected in some way to the greater body, that the wall of partition,
right,
in some ways is broken. Not in compromise, but just in knowing that we don't have to be afraid that we'll be seen that way. Like,
there's a cross in this room. We can't worship in here. It's like, dude, it's a church.
I just thought of several other congregations that have their own facilities too, that are really nice facilities. Beth Messiah in Columbus, Ohio. Rabbi Howard Silverman, Rabbi Barney Kasdan's congregation in San Diego has their own building.
Michael Wolf's in Cincinnati.
Yeah, there's quite a few now. Shuvah Yisrael in Long Island has their own facilities, and I mean there's a bunch of them.
Which was the congregation that they
Rabbi
built?
Kirk Gleby's congregation.
They built their own place, but they recently sold it because they had to buy a bigger place recently. Who was that?
Oh, that's in Melbourne.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Congregation Kol Mashiach.
Yep.
That had their own building. They outgrew their facility.
A number of years back.
They
it was kind of like you guys. They were wishing for something bigger for a long time.
They sold their building and moved into a larger facility. Shmuel Wokenfeld, I believe, just moved into a bigger facility of their own.
Beth Yeshua in Philly that did the same thing, just got a new building. But actually, Kol Mashiach was a really interesting, going back to the relationship between Messianic Judaism and the church and how things grown. Like, a lot of people don't know this. Kol Mashiach, when they were desperate for a bigger facility, they'd outgrown their space, and their building was really like a multi-purpose sanctuary. Mm-hmm. So they would have their service, and then they would have to flip half the room to have oneg and stuff like that. And so this church with this massive property, big campus, came to them and said, "Hey, we've dwindled. We can't afford to maintain this property anymore. We like your building. You like our building. Would you be willing to just swap and pay the difference?" And so it wasn't even just a matter of they sold their building and bought another one. It was like this handoff kind of a deal. They gave each other keys. There was a slight transfer of some money, and then they went in and started doing the work to make it the synagogue. But I mean, it was a tremendous blessing to them, and they got a great deal on it.
And Brian Samuels, his situation, he was renting a facility across from the street from a church, and the church pastor was resigning, and he actually invited Brian to become the shepherd of his congregation and move his. So now Brian is leading
I remember that.
The church on Sunday, but leading his congregation on Shabbat, and has that facility.
Yeah.
And then we had an opportunity. It didn't work out, but we had a unique opportunity, and that was that our local conservative synagogue, before we bought our current building, had offered to sell us their building if we would then rent the smaller building back to them for their Shabbat services. So one of the things that's changed in a great way that I want to talk about based on that is that the aversion of some of the traditional non-Messianic, non-Yeshua accepting Judaism to Messianic Judaism has dwindled some also. We're much more accepted by the greater Jewish world, not fully or not in the, but just the aversion is not as much there, to the point where we're actually having joint teachings with a local conservative rabbi at our synagogue, and had joint services and events with them. So that would have never happened 30 years ago.
And what's funny is it's the religious Jewish communities that have become less adverse, I guess. And it's ironically kind of the less religious, more secular, more just cultural Jewish congregations and communities that are like, oh no, we can't have that. But like conservative Judaism, even among the Orthodox, in Israel, some of the conversations that Messianics are having with them,
that's a huge change since the time of funerals and sitting shiva for believers.
One of the biggest changes, and I think most positive things I've seen, I would love to see a lot more. Part of the reason I do a lot of what I do, which ruffles some feathers from time to time, so to speak, is because I think unity is important. And one of the things that I've kind of watched over the past, I guess realistically, it's been the past like 20, 25 years, is growing up in the movement. There was almost this like gang war mentality between the MJIMCS and the UMJC.
The Jets and the Sharks.
Yeah, exactly. It was West Side Story. But you had it was like,
if he ever shows up here, we're going to take him out back.
Exactly. And so there was a point in time where, and I think it was because of something that happened at an MLR, that there was this group that developed called it was Grassroots is what it was called. And it was literally just younger Messianic Jewish believers who grew up in the movement in different areas of the movement, whether it was the missional side, the congregational side, the alliance side, the union side, whatever it was, just different areas that kind of lived the same life, had the same experiences, but never knew about the other, never knew the others existed, never knew. And they got together and were like, look, our parents had bad blood, but why are we carrying their offenses?
Right.
Like, our parents wouldn't do stuff together. Our parents wouldn't hang out. Why are we not working together? Why are we not building friendship and relationship? And I think that like spawned a lot. Now, previous to that, there was already some healing and restoration that had begun to occur between the MJ and the UMJC. And that was a great thing. And it brought a lot of stuff. But what I think I've seen the most of is the younger generations being kind of the driving force behind kind of fostering some more unity in the movement.
Well, the truth is that the IMCS, the MJAA, is really a response to the YMJA. In other words, the young people in the YMJA, the youth brought about the MJAA in a big way. Likewise, it seems that your generation and those beyond have also brought this desire for unity and all to the battle weary of the older generation, my generation and those older than me. So it tends to be the young people that are the emphasis and the leading of these kind of things.
And one of the things that I think is hope, it drives hope for me, is while some of the old guard still have the sort of ingrained distrust in each other, I don't think that exists as much in the younger generation of leaders in Messianic Judaism that are coming up. I talked about this some last night at our Bible study, is that one of the things I've noticed in my generation in leadership in the movement is that we're not fighting an identity crisis. We're not fighting the identity crisis that our parents did, which I think we talked about this on an episode once too.
Yeah, we did.
When my dad became a believer, the Jewish world disowned him and the Christian world told him he was no longer Jewish. And he spent the first probably 10, 15 years of my life trying to figure that out and justify it. Like, even once we got into Messianic Judaism, it was like, I watched as he tried to prove to the Christian world he was still a believer and hadn't like renounced Yeshua, and tried to prove to the Jewish world that he was still Jewish and why he could believe in Yeshua and still be Jewish. And I see that over the years throughout Messianic Judaism, there was always this, we've got to prove to both sides that we're really part of them. And I think one of the things my generation is coming to terms with is we really don't give a crap what anybody thinks. Because and I don't mean this a harsh way, but we've got to be honest about the reality of the fact that The traditional Jewish world is never going to accept us the way we would like to be accepted because of Yeshua. It doesn't matter how strict or perfectly we keep Jewish halakha. It doesn't matter how responsive we are or in-depth we are in how we do minyanim or how we follow Shulchan Aruch or whatever else. None of that's going to matter. Because at the end of the day, the traditional Jewish world still sees that we believe that Yeshua, that we believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And that's the end of the line for us. That's the end of the day.
God.
Yeah. And so that is a tremendous headache. Yeah, that's probably the biggest thing, is that we believe that he's God. We believe in the deity of Yeshua. And so so at the end of the day, I don't really care what anybody thinks of me, because I'm not trying to prove to anybody that I'm anything except that I'm a follower of God, that I'm a disciple of Yeshua. And my goal is to let God do the work.
Right.
And if he brings non-believing Jews into my mix, awesome. And if he brings Christians into my mix, awesome. And I think that's what we're seeing happen in the younger generation of leadership that's stepping up in the movement. Is there's less of a, again, for lack of a better word, there are less craps given on what the old guard thinks. And we just want to see the movement be successful and continue.
Right.
We want to pick up the work that the generations before us laid the groundwork for and run with it. And we want to take their legacy and make it into what it's supposed to be.
And I think part of that is that the younger generation is not as concerned with competition as they are with unity or working together to accomplish things. So they have an understanding, a kingdom mentality that's different than the survivalist mentality of those that were starting a young congregation or a young movement, and you were trying to take over the world. And
Stinky in the brain.
Yeah, so now there's less of that and more of understanding that, hey, if I'm going to do a street outreach, maybe I should reach out to Jews for Jesus because they're the experts at this. Or if I want to do a TV program or a live stream, I'm going to reach out to people who are successful at that. Or if I want to do a medical mission to somewhere, or if I want to do, whatever, I'm going to reach out to whoever it is from whatever organization it is that excels at that. And we're going to use the music from whichever person that we that speaks through what message we're trying to bring, regardless of if they're MJAA or UMJC or Jews for Jesus or Chosen Peoples or whatever. So the younger generation coming up is not circling the wagons to keep people in their organization or to keep people in their congregation in the way that the older generation was. And again, at a somewhat out of a survival, again, because, for instance, as Rabbi David said, when I became a believer, the nuclear response to someone then who was Jewish becoming a believer in Yeshua was much more dramatic than it is now. And because it was such a traumatic experience, you were automatically self-preserving. You were automatically defensive. You were automatically in that way where it's not, the world is not the same anymore.
You're in that fight or flight mode. Kind of. Yeah. There's we're kind of, we're like you said, circling. We're not circling the wagons anymore. We're much more preoccupied on planting the next season of crops on the homestead.
Well, some people are.
Some people are. Yeah.
I'm not gonna say, oh yeah, that's what everybody wants to do.
Sure. Yeah, it is. It's changing. It's growing.
And just a couple of weeks ago, I went to a conservative synagogue for Shabbat service at the invitation of the rabbi, and was welcomed by everybody there, and was not ostracized, and was greeted, and
you weren't treated as other.
It wasn't. Yeah, I was not the leper that was leper, stay away, unclean. But it was very welcoming, very loving. They invited us to come back next time we were in town, and all that. That would have never happened when I first became a believer. And because those things have shifted, I think it allows for some of the defenses to be taken down, so that more unity can come from that.
So I think I want to, as we get ready to kind of draw this episode to a conclusion, I want to throw out a question that will start with Rabbi Toby and just work clockwise around the table. If you could think of one thing, the most important thing you think is needed for a positive growth and future for the Messianic Jewish movement, what one change or deepening of roots of something in the Messianic Jewish movement, what's that one thing you think is necessary to see a healthy and productive future for the Messianic Jewish movement?
I think that we need to more. I think that organization, because I look at, there's two tiers of Messianic Jewish ministry. There's the local congregation, and then there's organizations. Mm-hmm. And I think that there needs to be. I'm not saying there isn't a clear delineation, but the thing is that I'm not going to. I think that most change and most impact had around the world for the gospel and for Messianic Judaism is done by local congregations. It's a ground up thing. That's always how I think God has always worked. It's how Yeshua worked. Was from a grassroots, and I think that's where the power is. I think organizations shouldn't be blamed for problems, but I also think they shouldn't be looked at to solve certain problems. I think that they facilitate, and I think that they provide an umbrella and things like that. But I think that the real source of revival and things like that, and the real source of unity, starts with local congregations. And I think organizations, whether it's union or alliance or whatever, I think that provides a place as a hub. It's simply a hub.
Right.
The hub doesn't do anything other than provide a space. Sometimes I think organizations think more of themselves than they really are.
Overreach.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that sometimes it's their fault, but I think sometimes we look to them as being,
right.
Like for instance, well, from what I've seen, organizations have done. The two organizations mainly are work against each other. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying they don't have moments of being on the same page, but in generally they conflict, and I think that doesn't surprise me.
Right.
And I don't, and I think so when I look at them and go, I don't think that them getting better is going to start there. I think it starts at the local congregations. But at any rate, though, so I think a change needs to be. There needs to be a focus on growing local congregations. I think planting congregations and then having a reasonable and affordable way for leaders to go through training and receive smicha. Right. Because I think that if you're planting congregations and congregations are growing, then I think that's where, look at the Bible. What did Paul do? Right. He planted and then he encouraged and he kept them connected, and that's what the apostles did.
Right.
And I think that that needs to be, I think, a change. I think is more of a focus on planting congregations and growing congregations, and lessening some certain standards of what an actual congregation is. Right. I just don't think that Paul and James and Peter would bicker over, is Ephesus a congregation? I mean, is Ephesus a congregation or not? Well, let's call it a friend of let's call it a friend of Jerusalem. I mean, some of this stuff that I think is dumb, and I think we need to get out of that way of thinking. And you know what really brings what brings us closer to that thinking? Persecution. I mean, that's just simply the truth. I think you're seeing a lot more unity with Jewish people because of October 7th. I hate that it takes something horrible for us to go, maybe we should stop talking about this dumb stuff and focus on what's important. But I think that growing congregations and training new leaders, I think, is the most important thing.
Right.
Two things that I would like to see that I think would help grow the...
Nope, got to narrow it down to one. That was the question. No.
the organization. I'm old, I can do two.
You can have part A and B.
Part A and B. One is I'd like to see the rest of the fear, operating out of fear, removed from fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing people, fear of being involved with, if we could stop operating out of fear and start operating completely out of faith, then we would see working together happen.
Yeah.
And then a focus away from the political to
the spiritual.
Spiritual.
Yep.
That our conservatism should run from a biblical reasoning, not a political. We're not trying to take over the United States. We're trying to build the kingdom. And I think those two things would be on either side. I'm not saying that our values should come because the Bible teaches them. Yeah. And we should be looking at Yeshua as the only hope for our faith and our who we are, not in other ways.
In regards to the fear comment, I think a lot of times, and I think this is true of most of our lives as believers, I think a lot of times, you picture like somebody enslaved or imprisoned, tied to a post or to a wall with shackles and chains, right? I think a lot of times, we're shackled to whatever that oppression and fear or whatever it is, we're shackled to it, but you get so tired, so hung up, sometimes you grip your hands around the chains to like have a hold on it so it's not pulling at your skin, pulling at your wrist. And I think God's broken the shackles, but we forget to let go of the chains sometimes. And I think that's the problem with the fear issue, is God's broken that spirit. We just haven't let go of it. Jonathan?
Yeah, and understanding that it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And the reality is, we've had people that started other works in Pensacola, and people have come to me and said, what are you going to do about that? And I'm not going to do anything about that. There's 300 and some odd thousand people in Pensacola. If all of them showed up on Shabbat, we couldn't fit them in our building.
Right.
So understanding that I'm not, it's not a matter of our congregation is the only place people can go to. And I would love to see Messianic synagogues all over cities and working together and encouraging. And there, we've said this before on our podcast, there are people that live closer to Rabbi David's congregation that drive to our congregation because they feel more at home here. And there's those that drive from Pensacola area to Rabbi David's because they feel more at home there. And we don't have an issue with that because it's the same kingdom. It's when Rabbi David has a new family join his congregation, our congregation just grew by a family. If Rabbi Wayne's congregation gets a new family, our congregation, because we're all the same congregation, it's not that we're fighting for
supremacy.
Yeah. It's not like there can be only one. We're not the Highlander. It's not about that. It's about
we're not the main character, as the kids say today.
So that would be, if we understood that you can grow by growing everybody, that when the tide rises, all the ships go up.
Yeah, I would not so much my fixing what I would fix, but it's another thing I've noticed, which is the first conference I attended, I think, was in 2021, and after that, again, a lot of the comments and things made at the pulpit have been decidedly very political in nature. And
when a conference opens up feeling like a political rally,
right. Yeah, I'm like, and again, not that I'm opposed to going to a political rally or anything like that, but when I show up and it's like, I can't decide if I'm here at a theological convention or at a Trump rally. That's problematic.
Well, I think the question is, what did you register for?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I want my money back.
Right,
I can. Trump probably charges less money anyway. But so the thing I would fix personally is I would fix and I don't think it's done intentionally, but I think it's done sloppily, is the patronizing of young people, the patronizing of millennials, young leaders. There's this attempt. I wouldn't put on such a show, because the past couple of years you go to conferences, and of course there's been comments made and things said and preached that have said, oh, we need to bring in younger leaders, have younger leaders give them more time teaching, being up on stage, showing the youthfulness of our movement. And so there is sort of this double speak that happens from the stage a lot, where there's this, there's this criticism of the younger generation and, oh, they're stupid, they don't know anything. While at the same time, let's get a stage full of young people to read from the Torah and do liturgy up here, and oh, they're involved. We've got young people. Da 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 da. Look at us.
The kids that always forget their talits.
Right. Yes, and so they're not preparing them. They're not preparing the young people, and there are young people who are preparing. There are young people, young leaders who are ready to step in, who want to step in. And I think, but if you continue to patronize them, they will eventually, they'll do like what many have already done. They find leadership positions in churches. They find that God gives them a gift to teach, to preach, to speak, to exhort. They will use that gift. It's up to a lot of the current leadership in Messianic Judaism to help them decide if they're going to use it for Messianic Judaism or not. So I would fix that.
I think for me, and this will be our closing, I think for me the biggest change that I think needs to happen in the coming years is we need to once and for all finally wrestle in a positive way with how to react and include Gentiles. I think on the local congregation, a lot of congregations have it right and do it right. I think Brit-Am, I think CMC, I think a number of others do it right. But I think there's still, and maybe it ties back to Rabbi Eric's comment on fear. I know that in the older generations of the Messianic movement, there was a fear of, well, if you let too many Gentiles in, then the same thing that happened in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century will happen today, and we'll lose the Jewish identity, the Messianic Jewish movement. And my question is do we actually believe, as we've taught for decades now, that this is an end-time revival that God has orchestrated, at which nobody can truly destroy it unless we get in our own way? Or do we not? And if we do, then it doesn't matter how many Gentiles come in. Because ultimately, all of Judaism has believed and taught for millennia that when the Mashiach comes, he'll draw the hearts of the nations to the Torah. And I believe that's what is happening in Messianic Judaism. So I think we need to, as a movement, on the organizational level, on the local congregational level, on the rabbinic level, we need to finally legitimately sit down and wrestle with the idea of how do we include Gentiles without making Gentiles feel lesser than. Like, it's one thing to talk out one side of our face and say that there's no hierarchy, that Jews aren't better than Gentiles, that, whatever. But then when we keep Gentiles at an arm's reach or farther, when we limit what Gentiles can do, when you have Gentiles who honestly 100% feel called to Messianic Judaism, this is all they know, this is their life, this is what they do, they've raised an entire family in Messianic Judaism, but then they're told in their congregation they can't wear a talit because they're not Jewish, or they can't participate in the Torah service because they're not Jewish, or their kids can't participate in B'nai Mitzvot because they're not Jewish, or what have you. And then we establish conversion processes and make people feel like, well, the only way you can truly be a part of what you're feeling called to is if you go through conversion, and then you can truly, and then some find out that even after that, it still didn't make any difference, and they're still treated the same and lesser than or whatever. I think Messianic Judaism requires Jew and Gentile alike together. I think if you do the math simply, if every single believer alive today became Messianic, and every single Jewish person alive today became believers in Messianic Judaism, you would still have a ton more Gentiles
7-to-1 at
than
least.
you do Jews.
Yeah.
The Jewish people are the smallest ethnos in the world. Like, we're a minority of minorities. As a matter of fact, we're a minority made up of other minorities too. But we're a minority of minorities, and to have this expectation that the modern Messianic Jewish movement should be purely Jewish, pure blood Jews, whatever, get over it. That's not what this is. That's not what it was in the 1st century, and that's not what it should continue to be. And so I think for the future of the Messianic movement, we need to honestly have that conversation and wrestle with it and come out on the other side with a healthy approach for Gentile involvement in the Messianic Jewish movement?
Because, and to add to what you were saying, because we have historical evidences of these believing communities that retain their Jewishness and remain solely Jewish. And by the end of the 2nd century, they all died out because they refused to embrace the Gentile mission of evangelizing to the nations and bringing the nations to Messiah. But they also couldn't marry into Jewish communities because other non-believing Jewish communities wouldn't marry their children to them.
Yep. And inbreeding produces problems.
And so they, the Jewish believers that embraced going to the nations lived on, and we're still here today, 2,000 years later. And again, a myriad of branches, but that same faith has persevered because that core group of Jewish believers went to the nations.
Yep.
Those that did not are no longer here today.
And with that, we appreciate you joining with us today. It was a blessing to be able to talk through some of this, and we hope it was a blessing to you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics Podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.